recording's not connected to anything because that's the HDMI that's not working.
Ready, so...
Yeah. Yeah, but then I switched to this chip so I can put stuff away in my house. What time is stuff starting tomorrow? If anyone I go to bed, I can like actually pick up. Okay. So I'll go to bed and do homework after. But there is someone for cameras, right? Okay. I can do that. Yeah. They'll probably do this and then tip over the Carmen and everything. Is what? Yeah, but if it's otherwise kind of sleeping. Okay, yeah. looks like they're about to start a new class.
I heard them over there. Yeah.
Where's the other audio coming from? Does it move back this way? Oh, yeah. So it's two.
I always ask.
You get on there, right? So we're good. So the whole thing will be done 9:30. 30? But we're starting late. Because it's after 7. Doesn't surprise me. STEM kids tend to have direct points of questions.
Yeah, I don't know. They just exist, and you put on this, and you play it, and I will do this.
How do I get mine on? Who's going to get mine?
It's all on there.
My presentation.
Oh yeah, I will give this to after I finish, or to easy, and then you can.
Logistics team should have it loaded.
They've got it loaded. And what do you press to take it
Hold on,
forward?
next one.
Which one do you press?
Hold on,
The blue
next
one?
You do the escape.
I don't know how to do it.
Hit B.
B?
B.
Oh, and how do I pick it up again? Okay.
When I get mine, how do you move the slides forward?
Yeah. So this is play, this is end, and you can go forward with this. Yeah.
Are you going to give your project?
Okay, sure. Wonderful experience.
Yeah.
Is it? No, I'm like, is that working?
Yeah, I'm sure it's waiting. I think we're going to start very shortly. Oh, I'm sure you can. Heather just said once the last panelist comes, then we'll start.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just so you know, everybody to go see me. But just so you know, thank you so much.
Oh, we have less. There's not that much people, so.
Yeah. Just pretend it's empty, right? Do you want a rip of this? Is Shaobo's.
Wait, are you sure you didn't rip it out?
Yeah, it was yours.
No, it is. Oh! Wait, there's only 2 pages.
Shaobo, I know. I have it. I got it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
we're good.
Is this working? Hello? Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Hello everyone, we're just about to start. Thank you.
What are you doing?
Wait, I need to get it out.
Just wait. Should we turn it on when I start speaking?
We should turn it on before we. I mean, if I make a mistake during the speech, you put it back, so we'll do it before.
Okay, that's fine.
Wonderful.
Okay.
As you can.
Just 1 second.
So. Distinguished guests, good evening. Welcome to the 34th Annual Norris and Margaret Madison EPIIC International Symposium. My name is Shaobo Zhou. I'm a sophomore at Tufts University from Beijing, China.
My name is Madison Reid. I'm a sophomore at Tufts University from Salt Lake City, Utah. Shaobo and I are both participants in this year's EPIIC colloquium. Today is a very special day, not only because it's the first day of our symposium, but also because it's the birthday of one of our own. Happy birthday to Gabe. Thank you for being with us today. EPIIC stands for Education for Public Inquiry and International Citizenship. Since its inception in 1985, EPIIC has inspired students and helped them become engaged, morally responsible, perceptive citizens. The foundation program of the Institute for Global Leadership, EPIIC reflects the IGL's core values of promoting nuanced understanding of global issues and giving students the tools to confront the world's most pressing challenges. EPIIC is a year-long class, allowing us to investigate international migration from all angles. We have spent hours upon hours digesting hundreds of pages of theory and policy on international migration. Our invigorating discussions on everything from border policies to colonial history have deepened our understanding of international migration, but also of human rights, geopolitics, and more. Distinguished guest speakers such as Ambassador Zanier of Italy and Zoltan Feher, a Hungarian diplomat, brought expertise and new perspectives. Never have I been so intrigued and engaged, challenged, and rewarded. As we sat in a circle each Tuesday and Thursday discussing issues like integration, we gained sincere respect for one another's voices. As we met weekly at the IGL to plan the symposium, we learned to trust one another and to accept and challenge our ideas and assumptions. Hard work for a common goal and hundreds of shared hours have brought us incredibly close. My EPIIC peers are a brilliant, thoughtful, kind group unlike any other. I am ever so grateful for the opportunity to be a participant in this year's EPIIC colloquium, and I'm honored to introduce our symposium to you today. Professor Williams often begins our reading discussions with an examination of the work's title, so I thought it only appropriate that we do the same today with the title of our symposium, Migration in a Turbulent World. The word turbulent strikes me. Why migration in a turbulent world and not just migration in today's world? Looking at the bigger picture, turbulent is quite an appropriate word for our current world order, one characterized by uncertainty, confusion, and conflict, by political instability and climate concerns, constricting borders and technological change. But turbulent also classifies every facet of the migratory experience on both a broad and an individual level. Turbulent conveys the personally difficult decision to leave for any reason, be it for safety concerns or economic opportunity. This word conveys tumult in states that drive people to leave their countries of origin, whether that is political turmoil, gender-based violence, economic strife, religious persecution, climate change, or any other motivating factor. The word turbulent encompasses the jarring and difficult experience of uprooting a life and building a new one far away from home, faced with challenges like political, religious, and racial discrimination, language barriers, and economic disadvantages.
Over the last 2 weeks, we have asked Tufts students to choose one word to define migration in today's world, and the results are seen here behind us. Many of them touch on something crucial to dialogue about migration, both here today and on a broader scale, the humanity of those we refer to with the word migrant. In the next few days, our panels of experts will offer us countless insightful analysis and opinions as we discuss migration through academic and professional angles, citing research and coding data. We must also not forget about the human aspect of migration. Remember, as we dress up in our business attire and speak today, there are human beings fighting to forge new lives thousands of miles away from home. There are human beings who are still struggling to learn new language, get a job, feed their children, or move out refugee camps like Dada or Zatri. These are things that we must not forget. Migration is an inherently international phenomenon, and no country or organization can properly address the wide variety of needs derived from migration without collaborative insights and collective actions. This is perhaps my biggest takeaway from this year's EPIIC course. As we gather here today from across the globe, we urge you, no matter where you're from and what you believe in, to step out of your preconceived notions, to learn from one another's differences, and seek common ground. In today's world, the importance of global citizenship can't be emphasized enough, and it is a core value that the Institute for Global Leadership has worked tirelessly to promote. We sincerely hope that the EPIIC Symposium will serve as a bridge to connect different parts of the world. It can function as a reminder that contemporary and future global challenges do not recognize borders and frequently necessitates global cooperation.
We would like to extend our warmest gratitude to the dedicated IGL administrators and staff. Professor Williams, Heather, Saida, Susan, and Stacy have worked incredibly hard to facilitate the opportunity for us, the EPIIC students, to plan this symposium. It has been a truly unique and exciting experience. Thank you.
To all our brilliant panelists, our sincere thanks. We're so happy to have you here with us. We look forward to hearing your perspectives, experiences, and insights. Thank you.
To our visiting international students and students from military academies, thank you for coming from all across the globe to join us in formal conversation and friendly debate. We are very grateful for your presence.
Finally, to our fellow EPIIC friends, thank you for your ceaseless effort and passion, for your enthusiasm and idea. Each of you has contributed greatly to bringing this symposium to life. Thank you.
We wish all in attendance an intellectually enriching and academically stimulating experience. We encourage you to ask questions, to learn from the panelists, and to learn from each other. We are very grateful to you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie and Shaobo, for your remarks. Good evening, and welcome to the first panel of the EPIIC Symposium on Migration in a Turbulent World. The focus of tonight's panel is Barriers to Belonging, Integration, Adaptation, and Exclusion. My name is Isabel Rosenbaum. I'm from New York, and I'm a member of this year's EPIIC class. Over the past 6 months, our research and class discussions have spanned a wide range of topics pertaining to migration, and we have heard from an astounding array of speakers. A common question that has emerged in our conversations, no matter the geographic region or political phenomenon of question, has been what happens to people after they migrate. No matter a person's background or reason for migrating, they will find themselves in a new community, perhaps with a new language, new political system, and new cultural expectations. Although the degree of difference between a person's country of origin and their destination may and does vary, All migrants must adapt to new communities, and in return, their new communities must adapt as well. Upon arrival, migrants face a multitude of social, political, and economic barriers to integration. Through discussion with our 4 panelists, who I'll shortly introduce, this panel will explore the challenges of migration after the physical journey concludes. Our panelists tonight are Fouad bin Ahmed, Professor Karen Jacobson, the Right Honourable David Lammy, Member of Parliament for Tottenham, and the Honourable Ratna Omidvar, Senator of Ontario. Many thanks to all of our panelists here tonight. Before we begin the evening's discussion, I just want to give a brief overview of how it will go. First, my colleague Patrick will introduce an award to Senator Omidvar, and then each panelist will begin their 12-minute remarks. These are structured essentially as like an oral op-ed. After these remarks, we'll then open to the audience for questions. Thank you. Patrick? Thank
you. Good evening. Thank you, Izzy, for the introduction. My name is Patrick Belliard Delbray, and it is a great honor for me, as well as for the rest of the EPIIC class, to present the Honorable Ratna Omidvar with the Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award. Senator Omidvar has been at the vanguard of diversity, migration, and inclusion efforts in Canada for almost 4 decades. Amongst her many achievements, she is the founding executive director and a distinguished visiting professor for the Global Diversity Exchange at Ryerson University. This organization is a think and do tank that looks to connect local experience and ideas with global networks of international leaders. Before this, Senator Omidvar was the president of Maytree, where she played an essential role in shaping the local, national, and international conversation on integration of migrants into society. Furthermore, she has been a member of a multitude of councils on migration, such as the World Refugee Council, the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council, and the Global Future Council on Migration hosted by the World Economic Forum. She has also held positions of leadership at the Environics Institute, Samara Canada, and Lifeline Syria. Senator Omidvar is co-author of Flight and Freedom, Stories of Escape to Canada, an open book Toronto Best Book of 2015, and one of the Toronto Star's top 5 good reads from Word on the Street. She is also a contributor to The Harper Factor and co-editor of 5 Good Ideas, Practical Strategies for Nonprofit Success. Her work in the field of migration has been recognized for its impact. She was named to The Economist's inaugural Global Diversity list as one of the top 10 diversity champions worldwide. She has also received the Lifetime Achievement Award from Civic Action and the Canadian Urban Institute for her strong commitment to civic leadership and city building. Additionally, she was appointed to the Order of Ontario and became a member for the Order of Canada, which are 2 honors that recognize her advocacy work on behalf of immigrants and devotion to reducing inequality in Canada. In April 2016, Prime Minister Trudeau appointed Ms. Omidvar to the Senate of Canada as an independent senator representing Ontario. Given her impressive record as a global citizen, it is an honor to present Senator Omidvar with the Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award. Honoring the work and life of renowned nutritionist and public intellectual Dr. Jean Mayer, Tufts University's 10th president and first chancellor, it was established in 1993 to recognize practitioners whose moral courage, personal integrity, and passion for scholarship resonated with the values Dr. Mayer held dearest to his mission. That scholarship, research, and teaching must be dedicated to solving the most pressing problems facing the world. Senator Omidvar's dedication to migration advocacy and academia are precisely what this award embodies. The award is inscribed with the following: in recognition of your exemplary service to those displaced and your unwavering commitment to diversity and inclusion. It is my honor to present Senator Omidvar with the 2019 Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award for her outstanding professional work. Round of applause, please.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for that wonderful introduction and award. I am not an academic in the purest sense of the word. I come to this discourse on migration and displacement and integration through lived experience, having been a refugee and an immigrant myself. I will admit to being maybe half an academic because I have an affiliation and a research institute at Ryerson University, but like many refugees and immigrants, my life has been less by design and more by accident, and today I am an accidental politician. Never set out to be one, but I am now. So it is very, very gratifying to be recognized in this way by one of the most hallowed universities in the United States with this group of students. So I'm truly honored and touched, and thank you very much. And I hope I will be able, with this validation, to continue my work in a different arena. So I'm going to strike a slightly positive and optimistic note in my observations on integration, exclusion, inclusion, belonging. And I'm going to do that not just because I'm a Canadian, but also because as a politician now, I have learned to become more pragmatic and more solution-seeking and less absolute in the solutions. And maybe we can have a discussion in the difference between policy on one hand and politics on the other. And I want to start off by observing some tensions that are obvious but maybe should be stated. So on the one hand, migration, its accompanying diversity, these are some of the most contested forces in the world today. So Collier noted this, that in terms of absolute importance, migration shouldn't rank up there, but it does. It is one of the most polarizing discourses that we have had in recent years. It bears the brunt of populism and has given rise to a particularly noxious kind of xenophobia. But on the other hand, it is also a source of much-needed talent and workers, the only way to prop up aging populations in different parts of the world, a rich source for innovation and cultural evolution. Indeed, some say for the progress of humankind, where more people mix and mingle with each other, the better it is for humankind. But here is my interesting sort of observation. And it is this: while these discussions on migration and global movements often, almost always take place at the national and global levels, the lived experience of integration, inclusion, belonging is most viscerally felt at the local level, in cities where most migrants tend to live. So, on the one hand, we think of it as a national experience, people moving from China to Australia or from India to the United States. But the first experience is almost always felt in a city school, a city bus, a city grocery store, and places like that. And I think of this conversation around post-arrival integration as one that is best had within a local space. And there are always three actors in this conversation: the migrant, the host community, the residents of the local community, and local institutions. My second observation sort of feeds off the first. We talk about migration, and certainly so far we have talked today about migration being a global construct. But, and I think Sir Paul Collier made this point as well, the public trust in the governance systems around migration and other issues, I'm sure, but since we're talking about migration, let's focus there. This public trust is greatly determined by the ability of governments to translate perceived national interest into benefits that one can touch and experience and share at a local level. So when national interests ride roughshod over local ones, then people begin to see immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers as a threat to national prosperity. And I think his point was that Brexit, the whole Brexit wave, may well have come from this lack of perceiving, touching, and feeling the benefits of migration, which were confined to London, but small town UK didn't experience these benefits. So I don't believe this is an abstract conversation. I don't believe it is enough to say that immigration is good for the economy. It's not enough to say immigration is a global phenomena and we just have to deal with it. It is not enough, sadly, academics to say evidence must support our analysis. Sadly, those times are gone. It is not enough to say that immigration done well serves our self-interest. the conversation about migration and integration has become very personal. And so we must make the conversation about integration personal as well. And so if we aspire to be welcoming, inclusive societies, then we must be able to demonstrate the benefits to local residents and tell these stories. I will tell you one story from my time, and I often remember one of the most lasting memories of inclusion was planting daffodils in my local community with the gardening club. That was a lasting memory for both my neighbors and for me, because guess what it did? I was engaging with them in a common shared interest. I was normalized in their eyes, and by the way, they were also normalized in my eyes. I also want to make a comment about the confusion around immigration and diversity. And they're obviously very closely tied together, but I don't believe that diversity and inclusion are the same. One, diversity is a demographic reality. Inclusion is a process that leads to equity and equality of opportunity. So regardless of where and when you came or where you came from, put differently, diversity is a demographic accident, I believe. Inclusion is what you do with it. That's what matters. And so I come to my fourth observation about prosperity. I believe very firmly, I know and experience that inclusion will lead to prosperity, but a prosperous city does not necessarily mean it is an inclusive city. An inclusive city is a peaceful city, a city of law and order, where people feel safe, where people feel included, and where people have voice. But inclusive cities, I will also say, just don't happen accidentally and with the passage of time. A high degree of intentionality is required, and this comes by sometimes through the conception and creation of institutional policies and laws, sometimes through the will of people as they elect governments, and sometimes through enlightened political leadership. And so I come to my final observation that just as people are moving to cities and migrants are moving to cities, to some extent democracy is also moving to cities. And the political clout of immigrants is growing, certainly in my country, and I think in the US you feel that. With people moving in masses, the electorate is also moving in masses to cities. And it may well be that it is at this local level that we are best positioned to strengthen democratic processes and institutions and combat all forms of extremism. This idea is very well articulated. I know I'm speaking to a bunch of students and aspiring academics, so I will use a phrase coined by Bruce Katz and Jeremy Novak of the Brookings Institute, and they call this the new localism. It's all about changing institutional policies in local jurisdictions where migration and diversity are growing phenomena. They are trending down from national governments and states and metropolitan communities, horizontally from the public sector to the private sector, public and civic sectors, and globally across circuits of capital, trade, and innovation. Again, I'm reminded of what Sir Paul Collier described in his description of the Jordan Compact. There was a moment where trade, innovation, and capital met together around humanitarian needs. I want to give you a few examples of what I mean, and I'm not geographically, I don't have a geographical blind spot. I will give you examples from what I know best, which is the city I live in, Toronto. So I'll give you an example from our local library. I arrived in Canada in 1981. You went to the library to borrow English books and return English books. Today, it's a place where you learn English, where you learn how to find a job, where you learn how to become a Canadian citizen, you learn how to make connections, you become Canadian, and most importantly of all, you just hang out there. And this is a foundation for social capital. This is where networks happen, where people meet. And I'm not surprised to learn that the Toronto Public Library, in fact, has the largest membership of any library system in North America. You know, thinking of other hallowed, sometimes rigid institutions like our museums. There are a number of museums in Toronto that are handing out free family membership passes for a year to new Canadian citizens. The local police, our local police was the last bastion of the pale, male, white, tall man. Well, guess what? It's transformed itself. Our police force looks very much like the people who live in the city. And this is an interesting example in Toronto because we are so ethnically diverse. Schools are building cricket pitches and not baseball diamonds. So this is a story that I tell you because it's institutions with intentionality that have made themselves instruments of belonging and integration. And I tell these stories with a purpose. I think it is far, far easier for cities to come together, beg, borrow, steal, adapt good ideas from each other than nation states, for very good reasons. Even more so today, and I think Mayor Bloomberg said it best when he said, while nations talk, cities act. And I also tell these stories because I believe very firmly that good ideas have long legs, and I recognize that bad ideas have long legs as well. But I do want to, in the balance of my time, focus a bit on the points of light that I have seen. My first takeaway is about institutional policies. They don't happen accidentally, they have to be intentional. My second takeaway is that local institutions can play a really important role in easing national pain, whatever that national pain is. Our national pain in Canada is reconciliation with Indigenous communities, and it is the City of Vancouver that for the first time has brought Canada's oldest people, Indigenous peoples, and Canada's newest people, immigrants, together to have a conversation. And I also believe that stories and narrative matter. Narratives can pull us apart. They can also pull us together. I don't believe that we should be telling narratives to further isolate the two divides between populism and pluralism. Instead, I believe that we should have narratives that build a bridge, that take into account that both sides have truth, half-truths, straight-out fiction, and lies, both sides. So we need something to bridge that, and it is these bridges of personal experience that I think will do that. I want to give you a bit of an insight into my world as a legislator and what I have done as a legislator to further integration and belonging. So I have had my failures and successes, and every legislator knows that you will have failures as you have a few successes. So I was incredibly fortunate. My first legislative intervention touched gold. I amended Canada's citizenship laws so that, in fact, in citizenship is the most meaningful indicator of belonging, so that citizenship would be easier to get and harder to lose. I next ventured into corporate governance policies with an eye on diversity, amending corporate governance laws to have some transparency around efforts to bring more women, more immigrants, more minorities to corporate boards. Completely unsuccessful there. Battened down, voted out. Now I am trying something new, and I'm tabling a piece of legislation that will go further than Canada's version of the Magnitsky Law, which holds corrupt foreign officials to account by seizing their money. My legislation will take it a bit further and not only freeze the money, but seize and redeploy it back, based on a court order, back to assist the victims of corruption, which in my theory are very closely tied to displacement, whether it's internal or external. Think of the Myanmar generals and their connection to the Rohingya refugees. So finally, if you will allow me, I want to make a observation about Canada and the United States. I realize you're an international group of students, but still I think it will hopefully ring true. We are cousins. We are the same, but we are different. Perhaps this difference is best articulated by three signature words in your Constitution. Yours are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Ours are peace, order, and good governance. It is no wonder then that you send people to the moon and we have healthcare that works. Okay? This plays itself out in the context of integration and belonging as well. At the federal level, and Kathleen can correct me if I am wrong, I don't believe the United States spends any significant amount of money on post-arrival integration. Canada, in comparison, spends a number of $1 billion on it because we want to level the playing field. So on the one hand, you have a highly libertarian, individualistic nation state as the United States. On the other hand, you have a highly collective imagination on the other. And perhaps we can have a discussion about what works best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator, for your remarks. They were really fantastic. I would now like to introduce our following panelist. Our next panelist is Mr. David Lammy, the Labour MP for Tottenham in the UK. He led the campaign for Windrush British citizens to be granted British citizenship and paid compensation by the government, forcing the Home Secretary to guarantee the citizenship of Commonwealth nationals, set up a specialist Commonwealth task force, and establish a compensation scheme. Mr. Lammy is also a regular contributor to many British newspapers and publications, such as The Guardian. If you would like to begin.
Okay, so I think that was a wonderful presentation from... Okay? Okay. That was a wonderful presentation from the Senator on how to integrate. And I think, generally speaking, across the developed world, Canada would be seen as a model of how to do it. I think the UK has in most recent times been seen as a multi-ethnic, multicultural country, but whether it has been successful at integration has depended in part on the nature of the community that has arrived, but also, frankly, on the complexion of the government. And certainly in the almost 20 years that I have been in UK politics, the policy issue of immigration has been in every single general election cycle. So this is a perennial umbilical issue, it seems to me, in the UK. So I want to talk, if you like, about the problems in an old country, and to illustrate that, it's best that we, I think, go straight to the front line. And even though the House of Commons might not feel like the front line, because it's an august chamber, if you like, of debate and discussion globally, you'll see why I say it's the front line of these issues. I hope this plays. No, it's not playing. How do I get this thing to play? Can you play it from the back? That one. Nope, it's not that one. We need the play button.
Okay, so forward one should work?
No, it didn't work.
It didn't?
Nope.
1 second. Is it this one?
No, it's to play that one. It's a video.
Oh, okay, I see. So,
Great. Oh, it needs volume.
That the relationship between this country and the West Indies and Caribbean is inextricable. The first British ships arrived in the Caribbean in 1623, and despite slavery, despite colonization, 25,000 Caribbeans served in the First World War and Second World War alongside British troops. When my parents and their generation arrived in this country under the Nationality Act of 1948, they arrived here as British citizens. It is inhumane and cruel for so many of that Windrush generation to have suffered so long in this condition, and for the Secretary of State only to have made a statement today on this issue. Can she explain how many have been deported? She suggested earlier that she would ask the High Commissioners. It is her department that has deported them. She should know the number. Can she tell the House how many have been detained as prisoners in their own country? Can she tell the House how many have been denied health under the National Health Service? How many have denied pensions? How many have lost their job? This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun under her Prime Minister. Let us call it as it is. If you lay down with dogs, you get fleas. And that is what has happened with this far-right rhetoric in this country. Can she apologise properly? Can she explain how quickly this team will act to ensure that the thousands of British men and women denied their rights in this country under her watch in the Home Office are satisfied?
She resigned 2 weeks later. We have a new Home Secretary, and she's just got into trouble today, actually, in the UK, because she described one of my black colleagues as coloured, and that really is a term that has fallen out of use. So what's this about? Why I think Windrush is so helpful is because, as an example, is it starts, what's happened in Britain is that a rhetoric that was really on the fringe, it was on the far right of British politics, led by a man called Nigel Farage and a new emerging party 20 years ago called UKIP, started as the British Independence Party, but it then became UKIP. This far right party has come to influence most of British politics. And so this led to a place where a group of British nationals, British not just because they came to Britain, as you can see there, because of the 1948 British Nationality Act, after the Second World War, when Britain needed to rebuild itself from the rubble of the Second World War, and by the way, borrowed quite a lot of money from the United States under the Marshall Plan to rebuild itself, but came to Britain because of a historic relationship with Britain. And that historic relationship happens to be an important one because it's a relationship that Britain, generally speaking, doesn't like to talk about. When British people are talking about slavery, they're generally talking about the United States, as if it was not something that they didn't invent and start. And Britain talks about empire, and we see wonderful films about Queen Victoria, but it doesn't talk about some of the problems of colonialism, the partition of India and Pakistan, why we have those straight lines in the continent of Africa. Britain's getting into all sorts of problems because it forgot that we have a border in the island of Ireland, largely because of British history, and that's causing real problems in our exit from the European Union. But here we have a group of people in the Caribbean who were there precisely because Britain brought their ancestors from the continent of Africa to the Caribbean. They then come to the United Kingdom, and this is the way that we treat them 50 years or so after they arrive, which is, of course, to begin to ask real questions about who is British, to deny these people rights to healthcare and to pensions, to deport some of them back to the Caribbean, to detain many of them. That's the context, and that is what the Windrush scandal was about. And in a sense, it's important also to say, and I raise this because the stories we tell become really, really important. After the Second World War, when Britain came up with the 1948 British Nationality Act, it was doing that in the wake of losing its empire. having an empire was costly and expensive, and quite rightly, there were people like Gandhi and others across much of the world fighting for that independence, and Britain was losing its empire. And Britain came up with the Nationality Act not because it thought that loads of people from the Caribbean, or indeed the continent of Africa, or indeed India would come to the UK, but because it believed and needed a different kind of labour to come to the United Kingdom. And it thought actually that they would come from what it called the White Dominions. The 1948 Nationality Act was about attracting Canadians, Kiwis from New Zealand, white Australians and white South Africans. It didn't really think hard about these black people that were going to come as well. And that's why by 1962, 1968, and this is the period of the first set of riots in Britain, the Notting Hill riots, and second generation Caribbean West Indians getting into quite a lot of problems with the police, not settling in schools, and the integration of particularly second generation immigrants who were now born into the country not going well. It's why the successive acts, then culminating in the 1971 Immigration Act, tightened up the rules to try and stop this migration or tighten your right to British citizenship. A lot of these people that arrived and they didn't actually bother to get passports and things because they were never going to go back. They were never going to be able to afford to go back to their home country. They didn't really travel or leave the country. They remained relatively working class and relatively poor. These were the people caught up in the scandal of not being able to prove that they were British despite paying so much taxes and contributing to Britain over so many years. Now, in this hostile environment that was set up in the United Kingdom because actually of a far-right rhetoric, and that's why I said to the Home Secretary, if you lay down with dogs, you get fleas. I was referring, of course, to the UKIP party as the dogs, and to the government as getting fleas as a consequence of getting into bed with that agenda. But as a consequence of that agenda, and those are the figures, probably 6,500 people affected, 164 wrongly removed or detained. Some of those have died. The government's only apologised to 18 of them. There's a young woman in my constituency, she's 19, wonderful young woman called Alberta. She's really in my head as I say this. She was in her flat one morning, showering. 5 immigration officers knock at the door, break the door down. She's half naked. They drag her to Yarlswood Detention Centre. She stays there for weeks. She's studying to become a nurse. She's not able to complete the course as a consequence of having to stay there. Deeply embarrassing. She has her period while she's being dragged away. That's how inhumane it is. And then the Home Office apologised to her 6 weeks later because they got the wrong person. And that is how pernicious the system has come. Now, the challenge is, for the vast majority of the UK public, their experience of immigration is really applying for a passport. And you apply for a passport, pay a small fee, and you get the passport. It's very efficient. For this significant minority of people, often people of colour, this system is pernicious. There's excessive fees. Landlords have to make checks on you. Hospitals have to make checks on you. The teachers make checks on children to see if you're entitled. It's a culture that feels oppressive and pernicious. This is the hostile environment that we create in this country. And of course, it's against a backdrop, and you'll hear much about this over the course of this week, frankly, of the entirety of the continent of Europe struggling and Fortress Britain and Fortress Europe putting up barriers as a consequence of this rhetoric affecting the mainstream. And so there is a phobia against asylum seekers. Britain's taken the least amount of European countries from Syria. The burden of much of the immigration falling to countries like Italy and more worryingly, Greece. Greece has got enough problems without Europe, washing its hands of the refugee problems and saying they can all stay in Greece and further down in southern Europe. And of course, now we've got this situation where, because of the stories, as I said, that you tell yourself, we have Brexit. This was a far-right project that becomes mainstream because David Cameron decides to hold a referendum. And basically, if you go to the school in Britain called Eton, you should never become Prime Minister because all of our Etonian Prime Ministers have failed. One tried to appease Hitler, Eden, and another caused the Suez Crisis, and now we have David Cameron with Brexit. And the point is, we had this referendum, the campaign was led very badly, the far right becomes the mainstream, and we've got a whole number of problems as a consequence of this. And worse still, because of that story I told you, of Britain not wanting to face its past and then tell a modern story of itself, we have Britain maintaining two myths about itself. One is that it is a country that won the Second World War on its own, which is best encapsulated in The Darkest Hour. Wonderful film, but a whole myth. Britain won the Second World War with the help of the United States, Russia, and much of the Commonwealth. But most Brits think Churchill did it virtually on his own. The second myth, of course, is the fact that Britain doesn't tend, certainly in its schools and its curriculum, tell that story of what it did during its colonial period. And so there's much of the Brexit rhetoric which is about recreating empire. Once we've thrown off the shackles of Europe, the world will embrace us and we can paint the Atlas pink once again, forgetting that the reason that the Atlas was pink was because we stole those countries by force, not by powerful negotiation. And the irony of Brexit, the great irony of Brexit, is that whilst a lot of the popular working class believe, as a consequence of exiting the European Union, immigration will come down because there will no longer be free movement of people across to the United Kingdom, actually, immigration will go up because when you go to negotiate with India, they will ask for visas and they will get them because you will be weak. When you go to negotiate with China, there's a lot of people, they will ask for visas and the middle class will arrive in the United Kingdom. And actually, I find it quite funny that the United Kingdom, despite leaving the European Union and despite the anti-immigrant rhetoric, is actually going to get, over the next 20, 30 years, as a consequence of leaving the European Union, a lot browner than it is now. I'll end there.
Thank you, Mr. Lammy, for those fascinating remarks looking at the role of history in creating the modern narrative. I'd now like to introduce Mr. Fouad Ben Ahmed, who works as a liaison between residents, especially youth, and the local government in Bondy, Paris. He was featured in the New Yorker article, Life in the Banlieues, and was previously at Tufts in 2016 when he participated in the EPIIC Symposium on Turmoil in Europe, and where he then received the Robert and Joanne Benenson Public Diplomacy Award. Please.
Bonsoir. Merci pour cette invitation. Merci à Bobby. Merci à la direction de Tufts.
Thank you for this invitation. Thank you to Bobby. Thank you to the management of everyone here at Tufts.
Je suis très honoré de participer à cette conférence, d'autant que je ne suis pas du tout un spécialiste des questions liées à l'immigration.
I'm very happy to be part of this conference, especially since I'm not a specialist and I'm not a learned academic.
J'ai conscience que ce soir, parler devant vous, qui êtes de futurs décideurs, de futurs peut-être diplomates, est quelque chose de très important.
And I'm aware that speaking in front of you tonight, who are possibly future deciders and diplomats, is very, very special. And I will speak from my experience on the streets.
Et je voulais aussi m'excuser, peut-être parce que Caroline devra en fait porter ma parole, et c'est pas une chose très simple à faire quand on doit faire une traduction sur des mots qui sont très importants.
Merci. He would like to apologize to me because he is not a speechwriter and he doesn't give speeches. He speaks from the guts, the heart, and from experience, and therefore he changes, and I will attest to this, his words as he goes along, and I am doing my best to keep up. So I accept your apology.
Thank you. Et on m'avait conseillé de préparer cette conférence à l'avance, et en fait je n'aime pas faire ça.
It was suggested to me that I should prepare my words and a speech for this conference, but I don't like to do that because it's not how I process and who I am and what I have to offer.
Et du coup, en fait, j'ai préparé cette intervention dans le train de New York à Boston.
And so he thought that he should, after my bidding, actually organize his thoughts at least on the train from New York to Boston, mostly so that I knew what I was going to have to translate, because I knew he was just going to come here and talk, and I begged him. So,
bon, on va commencer parce que j'ai déjà pris beaucoup de temps.
So he's going to go on because he's already taken too much time.
En fait, je me suis posé la question, l'immigration, qu'est-ce que c'est? Et c'est quoi en fait? Par quoi on peut commencer à en parler?
So he started with the question, immigration, what is it? Why are we talking about it? How can we talk about it in a different way?
Et le débat pourrait-il se porter sur une vision humaniste de l'immigration par une immigration acceptée et partagée?
He wants to put a perspective on immigration as something that has a more humanistic approach to the challenges of mass immigration, and to look at it in a way as something that could actually benefit the countries that are hosting and welcoming these immigrants, and not just as a difficulty.
Parce qu'en fait, l'immigration, très souvent, elle surfe sur les intérêts économiques, nationaux et politiques.
Since immigration walks a tightrope between economics, national and political interests.
Et c'est la pièce maîtresse en fait pour attirer un électorat très hostile à l'accueil des migrants.
And more it has been used by an extremist political party who uses it to impart fear and hostility towards immigrants and immigration for their own benefit.
Et auparavant, il y avait une volonté, ou pour certains, un semblant de volonté, de proposer une politique équilibrée, une politique pragmatique, mais à la fois humaniste, sans aller à l'encontre des intérêts nationaux.
In the past, there was at least a semblance of a willingness to propose a balanced policy, a pragmatic policy, and one that is as well human in welcoming immigrants and yet not safeguarding national interests.
Et l'accueil des migrants était le symbole de l'hospitalité.
And welcoming immigrants was a symbol of hospitality.
Et aujourd'hui, en fait, ce n'est plus le cas. Les plus populaires sont ceux qui ferment les portes, y compris ceux qui ont été déjà accueillis et qui ne souhaitent pas plus accueillir à leur tour, tout en prétextant un tas de fausses idées.
Today, this is no longer the case. A big majority want to close doors, build walls, and including those who have benefited from having immigrated themselves and sadly turn around and don't want to welcome those that are coming after them.
Et aujourd'hui, en fait, la question migratoire joue un rôle déterminant dans la montée du populisme.
And today, he believes that this mass migration is actually building up this reflex of anti-immigration and extreme right and extreme thinking that we are seeing everywhere in Europe and in America.
Mais les populistes, en fait, n'arrivent pas par hasard.
So can I say populism in France is different than what we consider populism, because I think that it's more, populism is more the idea of the people, and I think, if I'm correct, Bernie Sanders, all of, this idea of more of a social network, because he's been looking for the right word. Tu as trouvé que populism, and we had debate about this word.
Extreme.
So he's thinking extreme right, but I think it's maybe a big word for it.
Et très souvent, les extrêmes, en fait, se nourrissent de la défaillance de nos responsables, de nos décideurs.
And so this extremism is actually feeding off of the lack of progress and responsibility and the letdown from the deciders, the people who should be doing more for the population.
Et c'est très souvent, en fait, une manière de jouer avec l'électorat, d'essayer de capter son électeur.
So they use this to hijack votes. They use this to hijack ideas.
En fait, ils trouvent des coupables, le populiste trouve des coupables, et très souvent, les coupables sont ceux qui ne peuvent pas se défendre.
What they do is they put blame and they find culpable people, and often they are those who can't defend themselves.
Et ce que j'avais envie de dire aussi, c'est qu'il est plus aisé de plaire lorsque nous rejetons la faute sur l'autre. Et notre histoire en a déjà fait malheureusement la démonstration.
It is much easier to please a big majority when you blame others. And unfortunately, we've done this in the past. And all we are doing is repeating.
Que notre histoire, que notre
And so
histoire
we
a
are
déjà
just
fait la
repeating
démonstration.
history in a different form.
Et sans les ambitions de certains groupes politiques qui s'organisent de manière électoraliste, des solutions en fait pourraient voir le jour.
Ok. Ça a changé?
Non.
Truc politique?
En fait,
Ambition politique?
En fait, sans les ambitions de certains hommes politiques,
Ok.
on pourrait trouver des solutions pragmatiques.
Okay, so not distinguishing things such as the right of asylum or the need for immigrants in Europe is. I didn't really understand how he put this. I'm sorry. Répète.
Très souvent, en fait, les ambitions personnelles de certains hommes politiques passent avant l'intérêt commun.
So the personal ambitions pass over a majority interest.
Et pourquoi pas, en fait, ne pas sanctuariser le droit d'asile pour ceux qui sont en danger de mort, pour des raisons politiques, religieuses ou ethniques, pardon.
Tu me donnes?
Tu veux?
Yeah.
On en a dit.
Oui. Can you excuse us for a moment because he has words but I don't have them. C'est pas ça que j'ai.
Tu peux traduire sinon sans...
Je vais traduire sinon
Ouais,
parce que mais
comme
tu
ça.
dois aller plus doucement parce que tu as.
En fait, l'objectif aussi, c'est de pouvoir essayer de sanctuariser le droit d'asile, qui est un droit fondamental.
OK. Alors, there is a fundamental right, human right, to safety, whether it is political, whether it is economical. And we have somehow mixed all of it together. And it has to be reshaped. The dialogue around what immigration is, why immigration exists above and beyond the employ of those, the need that there is, for instance, to do certain jobs in Europe. And in this mixture, we are forgetting about those whose life depends on being accepted in other countries.
Et pourquoi pas non plus harmoniser les flux migratoires, souvent liés aux besoins économiques des migrants.
So if you can isolate the different kinds of needs of immigration, you could also harmonize or make it a positive flow related to, in that certain immigration will really become a benefit, but by mixing everything in the pot, tu répètes là, we are losing sight of what what are needs, and certain things are, when we're being seen, immigration is being seen as an invasion.
Et en fait, une cogestion des politiques d'immigration serait alors nécessaire.
So, in Europe, for instance, je vais voir ce que tu as écrit. In Europe, for instance, tu me dis ce que tu voulais nécessaire? Nécessaire.
Necessary.
So, in Europe, for instance, there are different needs in different countries, and different immigrants from various places will offer solutions to meet those needs. And everybody is blind to that. And they just look at the problem and how to incorporate, when in every form of immigration there's actually a benefit. And certainly in Europe, that has a diverse population and diverse needs, there is room, and it would then, for the people, as economically, be a very big positive, but it is not being discussed.
Et la peur de l'invasion de milliers de musulmans terroristes devient une obsession, et cette peur progresse.
This fear of this invasion of terrorists and in mass immigration is progressing.
Ce sentiment, qui est pourtant faux, nourrit les populistes et prône les insurrections électorales.
So once again, this serves to give fodder to the extreme thinkers that are on the rise in Europe and in America.
Et il faudrait aller vers une réforme qui vise à harmoniser les flux migratoires.
And once again, reform is necessary in separating the different types of migration.
La possibilité de co-gérer efficacement les flux entre le pays de transit
Oui.
et le pays d'arrivée
Tu lis là.
est déterminante. L'importance, en fait, de gérer les flux entre le pays de départ, le pays de transit et le pays d'arrivée.
Okay.
Une coordination.
If Europe was able to coordinate who is coming from where they want to go, what their strengths are, if there was, in essence, a think tank that could address, all of these immigrants could be siphoned through almost a UN system, ce que tu m'as dit, de la UN, and it would then become something that the different countries would desire, as opposed to fear and reject.
Et ce, notamment pour lutter contre la traite humaine.
And of course, in all of this, there has to be a huge emphasis on basically migrational slavery, or sexual abuse of women in migration. All of that also has to be addressed as part of the think tank.
Il y a un besoin d'harmonisation et d'efficacité.
Oui.
Et pour les migrants économiques, étudiants, entrepreneurs, c'est un drame pour le pays qui en fait se sépare de ces migrants.
So, for instance, qui se sépare.
En fait, on parle très rarement des migrants économiques et du drame en fait que ça peut avoir, des conséquences que ça peut avoir dans le pays d'où ils partent.
Okay.
Et je pense en fait qu'il faut aussi l'évoquer.
Okay, pardon. So, the migrants would then be seen as a partner, as an individual who's filling needs, and since in France we only discuss migration and economy, and we only discuss this fear of invasion and of Muslim invasion, if this think tank could have as a goal to harmonize immigration and then effectively manage, as though a company, comme tu as dit, une compagnie, une boîte.
Parce qu'en fait, pour le pays d'origine, c'est souvent les plus dynamiques qui partent.
So basically, in all the countries of origin, it is usually the brightest and the strongest and the toughest who have the courage to leave. So if there was put in place a think tank who found who these people were, it would allow them to then put in place a system where some of the brightest of all these countries could find room and a way to incorporate into jobs and also in education. Yeah, and
et la grande question en fait à se poser, c'est a-t-on les moyens de gérer les flux, d'augmenter les personnels de douaniers terre et mer,
He said the most basic needs of, having more personnel, having more people at the borders, having more customs.
De travailler sur l'information, le renseignement et de diminuer les délais de traitement des dossiers.
So within this think tank, there needs to be a massive computerized organization, which in essence would be an entirely new department, whether it's only for France or for Europe, that would bring people in, separate their strengths, and immediately put them into a system that will benefit from them, thereby reversing. Dis-moi.
Je continue.
Oui.
La question qui se pose aussi, c'est lors de l'arrivée du migrant, quels moyens en fait se donne-t-on pour qu'il soit dans une perspective de respecter l'identité nationale et culturelle du pays d'accueil?
So above and beyond this think tank that would put to use using all the benefits of immigrants arriving, there has to be a part of it to respect those that are living in that country, what it means to put out there the ideas of what it means to respect the national and cultural identity of the host country without losing your own culture.
Mais pour qu'il soit dans une perspective de respecter le pays d'accueil, il faut en fait qu'on l'accueille convenablement.
So in order for them to respect the host country, Fouad believes we have to welcome them properly first.
Et en fait, c'est une relation réciproque et de respect mutuel.
It then becomes a reciprocal relationship and one that can build over time mutual respect.
Et d'autres questions doivent être aussi posées, de délimiter les frontières aussi qui se trouvent entre l'intégration, l'assimilation et l'acculturation.
We also, and certainly that is the case in France and Europe, which are different than here, to make clear boundaries and between integration, assimilation, and acculturation, which is not happening right now.
Et pour finir,
Dis-moi pas ce que tu m'as dit,
l'acculturation.
So that people don't feel that they have to lose their own culture and yet respect that of the host country.
Et pour finir, nous devons redoubler d'efforts pour trouver cet équilibre qui permettra à chacun de vivre entièrement sa vie.
And for this, we have to double our efforts and create this new governmental or human think tank that would address that part of immigration, in essence, the more human part of immigration.
Et pour cela, nul n'aura besoin de renier son histoire, son identité, son origine ou sa culture.
And assure that the immigrant does not feel that he has to deny his culture, deny his roots. He's not asked even to embrace the culture of the host countries, only to respect it.
Et pour ma part, il n'est pas demandé à l'étranger d'épouser la culture du pays d'accueil, mais de la respecter.
So, in his part, he finds that would be the human twist that could change the way immigrants behave and feel about their experience and how they could then give back to the host country.
Parce qu'en fait, il ne s'agit pas d'un mariage forcé, mais de vivre ensemble, et surtout de vivre bien ensemble.
It is not a forced marriage. It is about us all living well together and living and having well-being and fulfillment while doing so.
Et n'oubliez pas que chacun de vous aura peut-être demain des choix à faire et que chaque choix sera peut-être une vie que vous aurez entre vos mains.
So, and all of us may face a choice tomorrow je comprends pas ce que tu dis là. Et demain, pardon?
Ces personnes, en fait, demain seront des décideurs.
Des décideurs,
chaque choix
tu
qu'ils
parles à
prendront
oui.
sera peut-être des choix qui engageront des vies.
So he is reminding all of you young folks who are here that you will find yourself in a position that the choices and the decisions you make will affect a human being's life.
Merci.
And to keep that in mind. Merci. Tu m'as tué là. I'm tearing this.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Ben Ahmed. I'd now like to introduce our final panelist of tonight, Dr. Karen Jacobson. Dr. Jacobson is a Henry J. Lair Professor in Global Migration at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where we sit, and the Friedman School of Nutrition. And she also directs the Refugees and Forced Migration Program at the Feinstein International Center, also at Tufts. And Professor Jacobson's current research explores urban displacement and global migration systems with a focus on the livelihoods and financial resilience of migrants and refugees. Please.
Thanks. Thank you so much for inviting me. Greetings, everyone. Delighted to be here and talking to you all about belonging. It's interesting to talk about belonging and think about it. I think that when we think about belonging, what it means, it's really a subjective feeling that we have, right? I mean, you can't really measure how people belong. It's how you feel. And I think that, as was mentioned earlier today, that how a person, how we feel about belonging is very much about the local community in which we live. Even in countries that have vicious, racist, and exclusionary laws and policies, and I'm going to talk about some of those in a minute, even in those countries, people can feel quite as if they belong in a place because of the community where they live. So what I'd like to talk a bit about today is not at this sort of abstract national policy level, but more about a project that I've started and been working on for a couple of years now. And this project is called the Refugees in Towns Project. And what we do with this is we identify refugees or migrants or people who live amongst the host population in towns across the world that are heavily affected by migration and refugee movements. And then we ask either refugees or migrants or people who live there, we ask them and help them to do a case study of their town. And we ask them to write about what the experience has been for them. If they're refugees, of what that experience has been when they come to the town and live in it for a while. If they're from the host population, we ask them what it's been like to have many refugees and migrants come to their area. And so we help them develop these cases about their towns. And we've been working on this for all over the world, so we have about 40 of these cases, some in North America, some in Europe, some in the Middle East, some in Africa. And we've been gathering these cases and trying to synthesize some of the understanding, some of the main themes that emerge from these cases as to how the purpose of the project is to try to understand integration. When does integration happen and when does it not happen? What are the barriers to integration? How do people overcome those barriers, right? So we've been talking today about the UK, about France, about Canada, but I want to talk about where most of the world's migrants and refugees live, which is in the global south, as we call it. Most of the world's refugees, there are about 25 million of them, live in the Middle East and Africa and South Asia. By far the majority. What we see in Europe and North America is a small minority of people who are displaced and migrate in the world, especially people who are resettled to the US and Canada and Europe. Very small, less than 1% of the world's refugees are resettled. So most of the world's refugees are living in the Middle East and in Turkey and in Africa. And furthermore, most of those people are not living in camps, as we think about. We know that most of those people are living in urban settings, in towns, mostly in capitals, but also in smaller towns. So what has this experience been like for people who are living in the towns and for people who are coming to those towns? So some of the strongest findings that have emerged from our work so far has been about what enables people to be integrated. What are the factors that enable integration, even when countries have quite strong anti-immigrant and anti-refugee laws and policies. At the level of communities and at the level of neighborhoods where people live, those are the factors that make a lot of difference, the biggest difference. So one of the strongest findings of the enablers of integration, which can, on the flip side, also be a barrier, is language. One of the things that that is clear is that if you speak the local language, it's going to help you integrate, it's going to help you feel as if you belong. And so we find that not speaking the language is a massive barrier to belonging and to integration. But furthermore, what's interesting in some of our findings is that it's not just about language. So for example, we all talk about Syrian refugees. Okay, this is most of the world's refugees today. But in the Middle East, there are also many other kinds of refugees, Palestinians, Iraqi refugees, others who are living in the same countries of the Middle East. And what we see there is let's take, for example, a country like Lebanon. Lebanon has we're not sure exactly because Lebanon stopped registering refugees a few years ago, but we suspect around 1.5 million refugees in a country of about 6 million people. 1 in 4 people are refugees in Lebanon. So most of them are Syrians, not living in camps. What we see there with Syrians, we've done a few studies in Lebanon now and have worked there quite a bit, and what we see is that it's very interesting how accent, everybody speaks Arabic, fine, but the accent that people have can often distinguish them. So if you're living in a town like Beirut or Tripoli in Lebanon and you are Syrian, you are quickly identified as Syrian, right? Even though you may not at first glance be able to determine whether a person is Syrian or not, your accent will give you away right away. So sometimes it's not just speaking the language, it's at a more fine-tuned level, it's what kind of accent you have that will determine whether you fit in and whether you belong or not, and can also help people discriminate against you. So one of the main problems that we see, the main barriers to integration and to belonging, is this discrimination and racism that we see, and harassment of people that we see in the main host countries of the world today. Sadly enough, Middle Eastern countries are renowned for racism, particularly toward Africans. If you are an African refugee living in Egypt, if you're from Sudan or Somalia or South Sudan or Eritrea or Ethiopia, you are constantly subject to harassment, racism, grotesque discrimination, and even violence on the streets of Cairo and other places in the Middle East. One thing we often talk about our own racism in this country, but we should recognize that in the countries of the Middle East and elsewhere, the countries of Asia, the racism against migrants and refugees will outdo us on every turn. We should just recognize that the problems that people are facing in these transit countries and cities are a lot worse than the problems they face here. What else? So local attitudes, what other barriers and enablers do we see? One of the biggest enablers, biggest ways in which people feel like they belong, is their ability to work and to go to school without being harassed, without being exploited and discriminated against, without having their children at risk when they walk to school because they're going to be harassed by local people, spat on, called names, subject to violence, where women walking along the street are subjected to violence frequently, and harassment all the time. But in cities and neighborhoods and places where the local population accepts people and treats them just like ordinary people, nobody's asking for special treatment. Everyone just wants to be left alone to get on with their lives. And in these kinds of communities, and there are plenty of them, in those communities, people feel like they belong. And in some of our most interesting cases have been in places like Turkey. In some of the smaller towns in Turkey, as you know, has 3.5 million Syrian refugees. But Turkey is a very large country, 80 million or so people. So these are a relatively small proportion. But Turkey has been surprisingly positive, not only in its policies towards Syrians, but also how Turkish people themselves have accepted and allowed people to become integrated when they're living in these towns. So you never know which places and which towns are going to be quite positive toward refugees. It's very much, it can vary a lot. One other interesting thing that we see in looking across these cases globally is how refugees, okay, so let's take a city like Cairo, where I've worked a lot and spent a lot of time. In Cairo Egypt has about 250,000 refugees today. About half of those, 55%, are Syrian refugees. Most of those people, about 180,000, are in Cairo. But when we look at this huge city of Cairo, we don't know the exact population, but the estimates are around 20 million. When we look at the city, obviously it's a drop in the bucket, 180,000 people. But actually, when we look more closely at what happens in a city, is that people, refugees or migrants, let's say refugees, cluster themselves in particular neighborhoods. The people carve out a space in a neighborhood for themselves where they as a community can live. So in certain parts of Cairo, for those of you familiar, places like Khair al-Asha or Adlua, these places are where Eritrean refugees live, or where Somali refugees live, or where South Sudanese are living and have their churches and schools and so forth. They carve out a space of inclusion for themselves in these towns. So what does all this mean for us? How do we understand? How can we support these kinds of entities? I think it is very important that we go beyond looking too closely at our own back doors, our own neighborhoods and our own what's happening to us here. We, of course, need to understand that, but we always pay a lot of attention to what's happening to us here. We should think more about how we can also help the people whose families have been left behind, often in these transit countries. So many of the Syrians, we don't have very many Syrians here anymore, but here in the US, because we have travel bans against Syrians, but other refugee populations in our country have families back in other transit countries. And the people who are living here have to support those people, because the people who made it to the US are seen as the lucky ones, are seen as the ones who won the lottery, who won the jackpot by being able to come to the US. And those people are obliged to help the people they left behind, their families they left behind, and many of whom are living in these cities and really struggling. So how can we think beyond our own neighborhoods and what's happening here in our own towns, which are, by the way, relatively small numbers of refugees anyway are coming? And how can we help the people who are in the countries that are most affected by refugee movements? So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobson, and thank you to all of our panelists for their opening remarks. And do any of the panelists have any questions for each other? Okay, I think we'll move right to the audience. Please, for your questions, as we want to keep the time in mind, please direct them at one panelist and restrict your questions to a minute or less. We have 2 microphones in each aisle. Please line up behind the microphone nearest to you if you'd like to ask a question. Thank you. Let's start on this side. Liam. And please introduce yourself before.
Hi,
So, look, I think the problem in Britain has been, one, a failure to talk about Europe and the European Union in a positive fashion over many years. It goes back to the narrative I said of we won the war. So there's still if we're playing Germany in the World Cup, it's like wartime. This is very immature, but this is the way that the United Kingdom has behaved. So what has happened since the referendum, in the last 2.5 years, we've had an accelerated debate about Europe. Now the British public do know a little bit about what the EU does for Britain. For example, substantial grants to the poorest areas of the country that will now lose out. Areas that voted against remaining in the European Union, parts of the northeast of the country, Newcastle, Sunderland, areas like that, who are now losing car manufacturing as a result. So the point is, what I was trying to get across is narrative, failure to tell stories and myths being told that then lead us to this place. Now there is populism in Britain on the left, my party, and on the right. That is in part, though, also a reaction to the huge inequality that Paul Collier talked about, that has opened up, obviously, in countries like the United Kingdom, and you can't hold the centre if you have those levels of inequality. The irony, the great sadness for someone like me, is that if we exit the European Union, my prediction is that inequality will grow. And the reason it will grow is because really the move to leave the European Union is a move by free marketeers that want more deregulation in the UK. They basically would like the UK to be the 51st state of America. They don't like the NHS, they'd like private healthcare to come and run our NHS. They don't want the regulation around workers' rights and other things that exist in the European Union. And actually there is a model where the UK is relatively successful outside of the European Union economically, but what will happen is it will be very successful for the richest and the wealthiest. At the bottom end, some of the inequality that we see in the United States, particularly, will come to the United Kingdom because we will cut back on welfare. So the very thing that people have voted to do something about, the elite is about to make worse. And actually, if we were struggling to cope with immigration from places like Poland, my God, we're going to be in trouble when we've got to compete with immigration from China and India.
Thank you.
Tu le traduis, Guillaume?
Donc, déjà, c'est une question qui est très pertinente. En fait, on a en ce moment les gilets jaunes en France.
Very pertinent question. We currently have the yellow vests in France.
Aujourd'hui, on sait à peu près qu'est-ce qui pourrait rendre la France meilleure et qu'est-ce qui pourrait apporter vraiment concrètement du bon dans les quartiers, par exemple, populaires.
Today we know what could improve the relations in France, what could make it a stronger country, especially in what is known as the popular neighborhoods.
En France, de quoi on a besoin? On a
France, what do we need?
juste besoin, en fait, que le droit commun soit respecté.
We just need that the common right be respected.
C'est quoi le droit commun?
What is the common right?
C'est de pouvoir bénéficier d'un droit, de quelque chose qu'on a acquis et quelque chose qui est réglementé.
It's to benefit of having rights.
Je vais prendre un exemple. L'exemple des pannes récurrentes d'ascenseurs.
For instance, we have an issue with elevators that break down in certain neighborhoods and certain types of buildings.
En France, nous sommes en train de créer une très grosse organisation nationale pour lutter contre les pannes récurrentes d'ascenseurs.
In France, we are creating an organization who will fight these unjust breakdowns of elevators in low-income housing and immigration, mostly immigrant housing.
Alors pour certains, une panne d'ascenseur, c'est pas grand-chose.
For many, elevator that breaks down is not a big deal.
Pour Guillaume, c'est pas grand-chose. Pour moi, c'est pas grand-chose.
For you, for me, it is not a big event.
Mais pour une personne en fauteuil roulant,
but for somebody in a wheelchair,
c'est quelque chose de très très grave.
It's something very, very difficult.
C'est un emprisonnement.
It's an imprisonment.
Et personne au gouvernement ne s'est jamais posé la question de pourquoi une personne est assignée à résidence, pourquoi une personne est emprisonnée chez elle sans que rien n'est fait pour lutter contre ça.
So nobody in the government has posed the question why somebody who then becomes a prisoner of a home when elevators go unrepaired for months and months and months and they're on the 14th floor. Nobody in the government has asked themselves this question. They are invisible people.
En France, on a des personnes qu'on appelle les personnes qui les non-recours.
Tu dis comme ça en fait.
Les non-recours.
Les non-recours.
Les non-recours. So in France, there is a group of people that are called those who have no recourse.
Ce sont des personnes qui doivent bénéficier de prestations sociales, mais en fait qui n'en bénéficient pas.
They are people who have rights as far as special needs that they may have, and yet receive none of the benefits that they're entitled to.
Ce qui produit des économies énormes au gouvernement, à l'État français.
Comment des économies?
Des économies, en fait, c'est des dépenses en moins.
Apologize. So this makes that the French government saves a lot of money not fixing elevators, not giving the care or assistance to those with those different and special needs.
Et pourtant, les politiques, tous dans l'ensemble, que ce soit à droite comme à gauche,
and politics, whether they are of the right or of the left,
se préoccupent des personnes qui vont toucher le chômage alors qu'ils pourraient travailler.
All their worries go into those who are getting Social Security and when they could actually be fit enough to work and get jobs.
Et en même temps, ils ne vont pas voter contre la fraude fiscale.
And that's where all of their energy goes to, instead of the fiscal fraud that exists within the government, who turns its back on the people and the rights that they inherently have, but are ignored by the governments.
Sans être dans un discours victimaire,
without being in a discourse of victimhood,
les élites, le gouvernement regarde davantage les intérêts des personnes puissantes.
The government looks after the interest of the powerful people,
plutôt que l'intérêt du petit français et des personnes qui sont en très grande fragilité.
Instead of the interest of the smaller Frenchmen and those who have different fragilities and limitations.
Et c'est pour ça en fait que la France se meurt et c'est pour ça que les gens sont aussi dans la rue.
Which is why France is, he's saying, is dying, but the better translation is crumbling, and that is why the people are marching in the streets.
Et il y a une certaine forme aussi de philosophie, de vie qui fait que aujourd'hui, on n'a pas en fait envie de défendre l'autre ou de protéger l'autre. En fait, on est dans une société qui est un peu chacun pour soi.
And it has created in France a society of not caring for the other and being worried about the other. It has created a society where it's each person for themselves.
Britain promotes Britain today despite rising populism?
In short, no. The Windrush victims have still not been compensated. There is no compensation scheme yet announced. There is not a substantial apology for the entirety of those people. And I would say that it's not as big in the public eye as it should be. Britain stopped deporting its own nationals abroad in 1868 when it stopped deporting people to Australia, and has quietly begun this on the sly, again, without much public debate. And the point to understand with the Windrush is that when you create a hostile environment, often when countries start to go down this road, the bureaucrats end up picking up the lowest hanging fruit, if you like. And these British people, because they were black, and because they'd been in the country years but a bit undocumented, were the lowest hanging fruit. So in a way it was an unintended consequence, but of course it's the consequence of that kind of action, because a lot of what I think the panel has talked about is really about a sort of 2-3 tierism that starts to come up in a country. And I think one of the challenges in Europe in terms of identity is, so I'm sitting here and I think that this audience sort of broadly understands that I'm a British politician and accepts the idea that I'm British, in fact. But am I English? Because I am from the country of England, and obviously the United Kingdom is made up of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well. And very few people would allow me to be English. And that's because, in a sense, the nationhood is caught up with an ethnic identity. And that is what is being contested across Europe. And, you know, but my view is, I'm afraid you have to broaden your understandings of ideas. It's a great shame that corrosive discussion has entered the United States, in fact, with Trump and all the rest of it, the Tea Party and all the rest that's led to it. It's really about who gets to claim first rights to the country. And my view is it's very hard for European countries that colonized much of the world years later, when the world starts to come home, to say sorry. Too late, guys, in my view.
Hi, my name is Bondy. And my question is for Dr. Jacobson. You touched upon my opinion there were just two communities within Cairo. Really, if you talk about the role that those play, not just in accepting that as the other countries, but how they may assist in the post-assimilation process or integration process of new migrants to their regions.
Thanks. I don't know if this is working. Thank you for that. A country like Egypt, the host government refugees are coming into Egypt. The host government really could care less about them. They don't have permission to work. They don't have good access to health services. They're there, they do what they have. Refugees try to survive there, hoping that the government will continue to turn a blind eye. Because if the government does not turn a blind eye, it will start deporting them and start enforcing its laws. That will be a problem. And in many countries, the laws of the country, if they were enforced, would be really bad for refugees. But they're not being enforced because countries don't have state capacity and so forth. And so they're only enforced periodically when the borders are closed or when people are deported and trucked off and so forth. So our best hope for these kinds of countries is that they stop paying attention to refugees, who can then manage on their own, along with the urban poor amongst whom they live. Refugees are living amongst urban poor, and how urban poor survive is also how the refugees will survive. They face the same kinds of problems for the most part. So we are, all of us who are working in this field are hoping that, We can just not have the government get involved, because if they do, there's trouble. It's basically a matter of how can we work sort of under the radar, and how can refugees work under the radar. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Davidson, I'm a freshman from Tufts University. I'm not part of the program, but I must ask, when you mentioned the thing about the lucky ones, that kind of struck me. I'm not a migrant or anything like that, but I'm immigrant from the US, and I'm here because of the lottery. I totally I couldn't agree more about the lucky ones kind of idea. But also after coming here, I did see that the people here, they also need a lot of help. When you said about looking beyond just neighborhoods to parts of the world that need help, I couldn't help but, also wonder, what can be done here too. And my question is, what is the balance between the neighborhood versus beyond the neighborhood?
Yeah, that's great. You won the diversity lottery? Yeah, great. Well, good for you, because that's over. And you were probably among the last to do that. Of course, we need to do more. And most countries have two kinds of policies. They have a refugee policy which tries to help refugees in other countries. Like the U.S. has a State Department tries to help refugees in other countries, and the U.S. is one of the biggest funders of refugees in other countries. And then the U.S. has its asylum policy, which brings people across the border or not. So many countries do have foreign assistance, and especially in the form of humanitarian assistance to help refugees, and foreign development assistance to help other countries, hopefully often with the goal of trying to stop migration. Yes. So of course there is that national component that we very much need to recognize. But everyone tends to always talk at that level, right? We always talk about national policy and what national governments do and are not doing and so forth. And I'd like us to reframe or rebalance the conversation a little bit to look at what's happening to people like you and what family you have to support back in Bangladesh and what's happening to your family here in the US. You probably have people back home in Bangladesh, and there's a connection between you two, right? So, and what's happening to you in your neighborhood, in your town, wherever you live, and your family, what's happening to them? And similarly with refugees who come, the few refugees who manage to come to the US, 26,000 we're at now for this year, 30,000 or so will be allowed into this year. They are going to have to support their families back home. So I think that piece that we really have to understand is these transnational connections and how people are when they come. So, it's really interesting. And as you know, what's happening back in Bangladesh is a concern for your family. But also a concern for your family is what's happening to them. Are they doing well in the neighborhood where you're living? And I think that piece is really important for us to pay attention to.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gabe, also a member of the EPIIC class this year. I have a question for Senator Omidvar. So something that kind of all the speakers have touched on tonight is the need for an almost change in mindset in local populations and destination countries to be more accepting of migrants and aware of the social and economic benefits that migrants can bring to their country. And you talked about how some of the core values of Canada have been very compatible with successful integration policies. And I was curious if what will it take in other countries, maybe that are also liberal democracies, where the citizens are the ones who elect the politicians, and where the citizens' mindsets have such a direct link to the policies that get put forward. So I'm curious what the mechanism is for changing people's minds, and given how the characteristics of Canada be applicable to other liberal democracies that may or may not have such compatible core values with integrating migrants.
Thank you for that question. I should, full disclosure, I don't think Canada has the best immigration system in the world or the best integration system in the world. It's a good system. There's lots of cracks, and I have a whole different speech, which is titled Good, Bad, and Ugly. I won't go there, because we have ugliness as well. But I think the issue of changing people's hearts and minds is a really important question. And I have sadly come to the conclusion that it is not going to be evidence that will change people's minds when they're engaging very emotionally with this issue. So I believe that one has to counter emotion with emotion, regardless of where that may be, in the United States or Canada or Europe, because people are people and they feel emotionally, which is why I believe that the personal stories of how a local immigrant has changed or touched your life, either in the school or in the library or in the hospital, and that story need not necessarily always be a good news story. I think there's nuance in this. If you tell the stories of truth, then you will find out that it takes a great deal of humility and patience on the behalf of the immigrant. It takes a great deal of resilience and understanding on the part of the local community as well. And if you build these bridges between populism on one side and, as I said, pluralism on the other side, and there are half-truths and lies on both sides. And I, for one, have always, and more so increasingly, rejected the narrative of the immigrant as a hero. I don't agree with that. I don't think those stories help us because, first of all, heroes have feet of clay. We know that. And ultimately, one day they will fall and take it all crashing down. So I prefer to normalize the integration experience. Little things like mothers talking about their children and the measles vaccine or whatever it may be. It's those kinds of human interaction on common interests that I think, and I believe, and I have seen it, change people's hearts and minds. I can give you lots and lots of examples, but one of the most heartening ones comes from an indigenous community in British Columbia. Indigenous communities in Canada are not wealthy. When Canada decided to take in 25,000 Syrian refugees, this small community of indigenous peoples put their hearts and minds and money together and sponsored a Syrian refugee family. And what's coming out of there is not all perfect. There is chaos, but guess what? There is also engaged conversation and interaction. So that's not a perfect answer, but I hope it helps you.
My name is Sebastian Reid. I'm from New York, and my question is for MP Lammy. I wanted to ask you, thanks. In your speech, you touched on the fear many people have of immigrants and refugees coming to their countries. And correct me if I'm wrong, you could strongly argue the reason Britain left the European Union was because they saw the Syrian refugees and they said, no, thank you, we don't want that. The rise of nationalist and populist movements within the United States and throughout Europe has been largely based on that fear of immigrants and refugees coming in. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the main cause of that fear? Is it having an uninformed public? Is it just human nature and tribalism? And for example, in the United States, I believe the statistic is by 2040, by 2050, white people will no longer be the outright majority in the United States. And just human nature of their group, fear of their group losing power? Or is it inequality and people feeling as if they've been forgotten over the past years by politicians with the rise of globalism, and they're just using immigrants and refugees as a scapegoat for their economic issues?
Okay.
Or is it a combination?
So in September, my new book will be coming out, and it's on this subject. It's called Tribes, How the Need to Belong Can Make or Break a Good Society. And it tries to scan across the growing tribalism in our midst, and what I think, in broad terms, governments need to do about it. It does seem to me that you have to build a very strong sense of national identity that's inclusive, and as a starting point. And it's certainly the case that you can drive those fears. The Leave campaign for leaving the European Union had a very famous poster that announced that millions of people would be coming into Britain from Turkey. No one who understands the European Union thinks Turkey is even vaguely close to entering the European Union. I mean, Greece would object for a start. You know, it's not, yeah, so Turkey are not coming into the European Union anytime soon, yet that was a mistruth told with fake news and Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and the Russians assisting with telling that story. So you can play to people's fears in an age of inequality. Look, it'd be too long for me to go into depth. Read my book when it comes out. But I do want to say one thing that I'm interested in. It does appear, now, go away and do the research, think about this, but it does appear that countries that are more federated, like Canada, like Germany, and some of the other Northern European countries, are handling things slightly better. What's that about? I think it's about diffusion, localization, and a powerful sense of belonging at the local level, and that is not currently present in the UK, where we have a very centralized system. It's also some of the northern European countries are able to have regional immigration policy. Now, if we had had regional immigration policy in the UK, things might be different, because you allow a region, let's say the northeast of Britain, say we don't feel that we need immigration, and therefore people can only be in London or somewhere else that does want immigration. And maybe after 3 or 4 years, you can move from that region. I think that's helpful, because I think that you then see a region then works out after a while, actually, shit, we do need the immigrants, and changes the policy. But allow people to have local determination. Allow them to play out their local fears juxtaposed by a neighboring region that's going in a different direction and what's actually happening. So in a globalized world, you do have to keep quite a lot of power locally. And countries that aren't doing that well seem to be struggling more with these complex issues around immigration. Okay. Canada obviously has a very good relative to other countries.
Okay, I will weigh in there. One of the problems in our country, as in other federated systems, is there's a hierarchy of authority from the federal to the state to the local, and the local always comes last. And there's a lot of noise in between. And so, for instance, our federal government has had a hard time getting money for refugee integration to local communities, because the province has said, we want to take the money and distribute it across the province, as opposed to distribute it to the city or the community that is receiving the highest number of immigrants or refugees in this case. So it's not perfect, but I agree with you that diffusion and collapsing levels of power down to the local level as much as you can is possibly a route to think about and expand and explore, and I would love academics to do that, and I'm sure they have already, but more of that.
All right, thank you both.
Hi, my name is Arjun, and I'm in the EPIIC class. First of all, Senator Omidvar, congratulations on your award. I wanted to ask you whether Toronto has faced any major economic problems with a rise in immigration. And if so, what have been the specific measures to mitigate things like competition in jobs or rising housing prices?
That's a very good question. Again, because our local housing authorities, let's go to housing, because that has created a real issue. In the summer, I went to visit the hotel in the outskirts of Toronto where the large number of asylum seekers who were crossing over from the US borders were being domiciled. And I cannot tell you the level of resentment in Toronto that, because people found out, and they said, so the government is putting up asylum seekers, not refugees, they're asylum seekers, and there is a difference, in a hotel with air conditioning, with food, with cleaning, and what do I get? So I think this feeling of being left behind is very real. So the housing situation, I think, will only improve with national, federal, massive investments in housing where there is a growing population, as in the GTA. And that is inclusive of immigrants and refugees. I would hesitate to say there should be a special initiative, because then it would simply separate the population. We need that big, broad band of public confidence in the system. In terms of jobs, I would say there is less a competition for jobs in Canada, and there is more of a competition for the jobs at the bottom. And this is a problem. When you disaggregate our labor market, our labor force participation rates, there are a couple of things that really scream out at you. That more immigrants are in precarious work, holding down 1, 2, 3 jobs, and that the gender lens on this is actually even more worrying, because there are more women in precarious work. So labor laws in our country are a state responsibility, not a federal responsibility. So here again, you have this push and pull between levers of authority that need to be figured out. But I will say this about Toronto in the main. Over time, it works out. And that time may be a long time. In my case, it took me, 7 years to pay the immigration penalty. And I have another speech written about the immigration penalty, which I won't give. But it did cost me the 7 best years of my working life, and that of my partner as well. But we were able to make it up. And all the research and evidence tells you that over the long term, immigrants and refugees in Canada will succeed, if not in their own lives, in the lives of their children. And I can say, if you go to any university in Toronto, this is not the demographic you would get. This is absolutely not the demographic you would get. It would be a sea of diversity, the way our city is a sea of diversity. So, I think by accident, a little bit by accident, a little bit by design, we seem to have found the way to long-term success. It's the short term that is giving us angst because of the precarious work, the housing situations, and I sometimes question whether Canada has lost its patience to invest, because integration doesn't happen overnight. I think it can take 10, 15, 20 years. And we wanted to turn on a dime, and that's simply not possible. So I question the patience, our national patience in this whole discourse.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we have 4 more questions. Okay, I think we're going to cut it off after that. Thank you.
Yes, so I am a student. I'm from China, Peking University. My Chinese name is Lu Jianzhang. And then I have a question for MP Lammy. I've noticed that you sometimes mention Chinese and Indian immigrants trying to apply for either visas or trying to apply for citizenship in the United Kingdom. So I was very curious on what do the mainstream UK politicians view this kind of phenomenon, and whether they view it as a negative phenomenon, and if yes, then why do they think that way? Thank you very much.
So this is the elite lying to the populace, right? the populists have been sold this lie that immigration is going to fall. The elite know that China is a much bigger economy than ours. India is a growing, emerging economy. These are important, powerful countries, and England on its own, as we're seeing, is weak. The United Kingdom has occupied this amazing place really after the end of empire, where it has been at the top table of Europe alongside Germany and France, and it has had the ear of the United States. So its power, frankly, in the global world has been considerable, given the size of its population, and indeed to some extent its economy. Japan has got a slightly larger economy than ours. You could argue that our international influence is greater than Japan's, even though their economy is bigger than ours. Now we go back to a place where we lose that influence, because the United States will increasingly, because it can't use Britain to lever situations in Germany and France, will go back actually to talking to Germany, I think, considerably. They did that before we entered the European Union. And the situation is that the leverage that the Chinese and the Chinese middle class want is they want access to they want access to our education system, they want access to our housing market where they can park funds and see money rise in London, and they will get those visas. Because there's no way we will not be able to give them those visas in return for the trade deal that we desperately want from them. So now what will happen is that will be sold to the population as, don't worry, it's not like free movement from Europe where we couldn't control how many Poles were going to come. We can set a limit on the visas, so it's going to be fine. Problem is there are 1 billion Chinese, right? And quite a lot of middle class Chinese. I met a Chinese businessman who was saying to me, my son's going to the London School of Economics. I said, it's a great school. You know, when did he start? What's he studying? He said, no, my son's 2. But but I bought an apartment ready for him. This is the middle class in China. You know, it's happening. So this is what's going to... And if you go to cities like Sydney, Vancouver, parts of Silicon Valley, you can see what will be arriving in London and what will be arriving in the United Kingdom. So what I mean, so my politics is saying to you, once you give in to this hard right rhetoric, once you give in to this you open up something in a country that is going to be very, very hard to put away, because the truth of globalization, the truth of climate change, the truth of the problems that exist in the Horn of Africa is that immigration is going to continue, of course it is, at relatively an accelerated rate.
Thank you very much.
That was good. That was great.
Hello, my name is Zach Goldberg. I'm a part of this year's EPIIC colloquium, and my question is also directed to Mr. Lammy. You were obviously very critical of Brexit in your introduction, but and then afterward you mentioned that the more autonomy local governments have relative to migration policy or any policy, the more effective it is. Is it possible that in a post-Brexit Britain that local governments will be given slightly more autonomy relative to all policy?
Yes, I mean, I think that there will still be a tension between national government feeling it's got to set a plan in our direction, because our country is now more divided, more torn apart than it's ever been. Hate crimes rising. Britain is feeling very, very divided. However, I don't see how you can deliver on the promise of the reasons why we're exiting Europe without much greater devolution downwards, down to the local level. So I think that we should see that. But there is a tradition of the elite, the educated liberal elite, letting down the populace. So it's not for sure. We'll see. Come back and ask me in 10 years.
It's interesting.
Hi, I'm Rugam Gusari, and I had a question. I'm in the EPIIC colloquium this year, and a question for Mr. Ben Ahmed. So in France, what we see today, particularly in Paris, are the banlieues where we see a lot of segregated communities, especially on ethnic and diasporic lines. So is it, in your opinion, do you see this as a failure of the underlying philosophy or the top-down political intentions and motivations, or the failure of civil society and NGOs and on-the-ground people and actors?
Alors, je pense qu'il y a plusieurs en fait ségrégations.
There are many different segregations.
Il y a la ségrégation sociale,
Social segregation,
et ethnique.
ethnic.
Et c'est des choses que moi combats au quotidien.
I see this daily and I fight this daily.
Mais force est de constater que quand on habite dans un quartier populaire,
When you live in one of the popular, more difficult neighborhoods,
et qu'on a un prénom qui est issu de l'immigration,
and you have a first name that is issued from immigration, obvious first name,
eh ben on a 20 fois, voire 30 fois moins de chances d'obtenir un emploi que quelqu'un d'autre.
we have 20, even 30 fewer chances than others. It is 20 or 30 times harder for us to get a job.
La grande question, c'est que en France, comme dans beaucoup d'autres pays,
The big question is in France, like many other countries,
on n'accepte pas l'autre.
we don't accept the other.
Et on pourrait faire une thématique ici qui viserait à débattre sur l'intégration de l'autre.
There could be, an entire 3 days spent on a debate about not only integrating the other, but why don't we want to integrate the other?
Et récemment, il y a eu un grand débat, enfin une grande discussion, un grand débat sur le hijab qui était vendu par Decathlon.
For instance, we had a huge debate recently in France in regards to the hijab that was sold by Decathlon. Decathlon is like a French Nike, very big sports store.
Et il y a une question qui est liée à la loi.
That we also have a question of French law.
Mais les gens étaient au-delà de la loi.
But people went beyond the law. I'm sorry, I'm going to let him finish. Continue.
Et ils ont parlé en fait de moralité.
So it became an issue of morality as opposed to just respecting a law.
Et Decathlon a retiré la vente du hijab.
And so Decathlon, the sporting goods store who had created a hijab for women to wear when they do sports, was forced under pressure to stop selling it.
Alors que la vraie question en fait, elle est est-ce qu'ils avaient le droit de le vendre ou pas?
But the question poses itself, did they have the right to sell it under French law, where there's a huge separation of church and state? And if so, how can the people stop them?
Et autre chose, en France, beaucoup de responsables politiques, des maires de villes,
Another thing, in France, many responsibles, the mayors of the smaller cities,
mettent en place des dispositions pour empêcher les sans domicile fixe de pouvoir dormir à l'extérieur.
so they have a lot of autonomy for their own neighborhoods. And for instance, they will allow, say that in France, when you are homeless, you're called without a fixed domicile. So, and there are many there in France, like in other countries, but mayors have the right in their own jurisdiction to say you are not allowed to congregate here, and they can go to jail. They have that autonomy.
Dans les bancs, par exemple, ils vont mettre des barres pour pas que les sans domicile fixe dorment sur le banc.
So whether you put bars on benches so that nobody can sleep on them,
Ou des piquants par terre.
or they put these pointed things that would,
Ça coûte beaucoup d'argent.
cost a lot of money.
Il y a une culture du contre et il n'y a pas une culture du pour.
So there's a culture of being against instead of being for. So the money that could be spent to help is wasted on combating issues.
globalement, il y a un réel problème. J'ai pris deux exemples complètement différents, mais en France, il y a un réel problème de l'intégration de l'autre.
So obviously, globally, we have this problem of integration of the other. But in France now, there is a really deepening problem in this regard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Gabriel. I'm from Brazil. First of all, thank you all for the brilliant speeches. And my question goes to Senator Omidvar. And much has been said about the role of the host countries and the local communities. So my question is, what would be the role of the migrant himself in this process of integration and adaptation in the new country?
Thank you for that question. That's an excellent question to close this debate on. So Paul Collier talked about mutual benefit. And there are, I believe, mutual responsibilities as well. Host countries have the responsibility to treat people who are resident in their community through the lens of the rule of law. The same law should apply to everybody. And immigrants, in turn, I believe, have to make sustained and transparent commitments to doing the business of integration, which is one, learning the language. That is the most important thing. Second, participating with their children in school activities. That is incredibly important. All the research tells you that when parents participate in school with their children around sports activities or cultural activities, they integrate faster because they have a common interest in the children. I believe they also have a responsibility to learn and to reflect on the values of the host society. So this is where, values are difficult. Not unlike other receiving countries, we have a bit of a rub around the rights that are embedded in a religion versus the rights in a secular society. And that is a rub that I don't believe Canada has completely come to grips with. But it is, I believe, the responsibility over time of the individual to consider and reflect on the social norms and values of the country. There are many written rules in every society. I think it's the unwritten rules that are important yet quite difficult to wrap your heads around. So I'll give you an example from my own life. I come from a culture where you obey your parents. I brought up my children to question my authority, and sometimes I want to kill myself for doing that because they do not listen to me. But they are two girls, they're all grown up, but they are living examples of free women in one of the freest societies in the world, and I take great pride in that. But I've had to sacrifice my notions of authority. I've had to do that. It's part of the accommodation that we both make. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
I just want to come in here because I think it is important within that context, because it hasn't really come up, for countries to understand different immigrant communities and the differences they may bring and store that knowledge somehow for future immigrant communities. What do I mean by that? When I talked about the Windrush and the Caribbean communities, these are former enslaved communities similar to African Americans that come with all of the psychological issues associated with that. There are immigrants to the UK from failed states, states where there is no recognizable proper education system. We have immigrants from the Congo, from Somalia, and it's important for the host country to understand and get underneath the sorts of needs that exist in those sorts of communities. And then, of course, there are communities that have come from southern Indian continent particularly, are now emerging rather like Jewish communities that have arrived in Britain, working in certain professions, pretty mercantile. They're doing relatively well in broader society. And then there are some of the challenges with that rub that was highlighted between religion and secular society, and that is an issue. It's an issue among many countries, and it's particularly pertinent in relation to some, not all, some Muslim communities. So I do think that distinguishing between communities is quite important, understanding what works and what didn't work, and actually, if Britain had stored up much more knowledge around what went wrong with second-generation African Caribbean communities, it would now be doing far better with, say, the integration of Somali communities where similar problems are arising. And actually this is a global movement, because I happen to know that in Toronto there are also issues with African Caribbean former communities, and that knowledge has simply not been shared or sufficiently understood, and frankly it should have been, because the issues were obvious. You can see them here in part in African American, some parts of the African American community.
I should add to your question the top answer, which I forgot, and I just remembered it. The first rule is, thou shalt obey the law. The rule of law is really important. I don't care where you came from. You know, the rule of law, to respect the rule of law has a primacy in all societies. If you don't like the law, fine, agitate against it, change it, get democratically engaged, and I think that's a wonderful thing, but obey the law as it is written.
Thank you, Senator Omidvar, for those final words and for this lively discussion. Thank you to all of our panelists. Professor Jacobson had to leave earlier. Thank you. And thank you for staying late. I know we ran over and had a late start. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. You did that very well.